to the Authors Club's LitFest online. I'm a member of the Authors Club, and I'm delighted to be introducing Michal Arditti. I've been really enjoying his book, The Anointed, during the lockdown. I think we all want to escape to a completely different place and time, and The Anointed certainly did that for me. Michal is a theatre critic, a very distinguished novelist with a whole string of novels to his name. But in recent years, with novels like The Celibate and Of Men and Angels and Easter and Jubilate, he's really been looking at issues of faith. In Of Men and Angels, he did take a look at the Genesis story, but here he's gone back to the Bible with The Anointed, and it is the story of three extraordinary women in the life of King David. So welcome, Michal. I think you've written a fantastic book, so let's have a little chat about it. What attracted you to this story? It is absolutely, it's filled with smiting, it's filled with sex and violence. Was that what attracted you?
Well, you've almost said it all. King David is probably the most exciting figure in the Old Testament. There are more references to him, in fact, than to anybody else in the Old Testament and to anybody in the entire Bible other than Jesus. And I think the only figure that I can find in sort of the ancient world that has his complexity is Odysseus. But many, many people write, and indeed are writing about the Greek myths. They're reinterpreting them for the present day. Very few people, I'm trying to think of almost anybody at the moment, who's doing the same for biblical myths, which are equally rich, but I think people have a memory just of sitting in RE classes, and that puts them off. So David himself, I mean, you look at him, he's a man who was a shepherd boy who killed, whether Goliath was a giant or not, but killed this huge Philistine champion. He became King Saul's, I beg your pardon, right-hand man, led his armies, and then betrayed him. And not only betrayed him, but went actually to the Philistine king, King Achish of Gath. He was a man who supposedly wrote some of the Psalms. He brought the ark to Jerusalem, and yet God considered him too sinful to build the temple. He defeated Israel's enemies. He really fortified the kingdom, and yet he couldn't control his own children, one of whom raped his half-sister, and the other of whom rebelled.
He had an awful lot of children, didn't he?
Yes. I mean, not many of them are key in the Bible. Sorry, not many of them, well, or in the Bible or in my story. There are only about 4 that are. And he had a lot of wives as well. But this man of huge complexities, also, it's not just complexities, some of them are absolute contradictions in the Bible story. So one of the ways I wanted to get into him was to look at him from various perspectives. And it was immediately clear to me that I wanted to do it through his wives. I mean, the two came at the same time, partly because the 3 I've chosen, though, as I've said, there were several others, but most of them are shadowy. Michal, Abigail, and Bathsheba are absolutely integral to his story. He couldn't have got where he did without any of them. But also, for a personal reason, and that you kindly mentioned of Men and Angels, well, that looked at the story of Lot in Sodom, but much more through its cultural and historical aftermath. But it was a book very much about men, not exclusively, but largely. And so I really wanted my next book, just for my own sake, to be focused on women. And there's nowhere that I felt it should better focus on women than the Bible. Because if you look at the Old Testament, it was a series of books, we can't really call it a book, but written by men about the deeds of men for men to read and hear in the temple. The women, when they are mentioned, are either sort of selfless matriarchs like Hannah and Sarah and Rachel, or really sort of deceiving harlots like Delilah and Jezebel. And of course, the mother of them all, Eve. And it seemed to me that there was much more well, it's self-evident to women at the time. And so, as there's so little about these women in the story, in the books of Samuel, and yet they are so integral to the story, it left some wonderful open spaces that I tried to fill.
It's terrific for a novelist, and character is all important. How did you kind of read between the lines of the Bible to get character and power and voice, which is what you do so well, I think, in The Anointed?
Well, Michal, who was David's first wife, was the most interesting to me from the start, because she was a young girl. She was 14, 15, when she first heard David play for her father, because Saul was beset by an evil spirit, and she heard him play and really fell for him. He was a sort of rock star, which was, of course, helped considerably when he came back, having killed Goliath. Whether it was helped quite so much when he fulfilled Saul's demand that he bring back 200 Philistine foreskins is another matter. But
he's like a rock star and a sports hero.
Yes, I mean, you couldn't really get anybody more attractive. Of course, one of the problems is when you discover that actually he's in love with your brother. And she is the one who was most, because she goes right the way through David's career, and he discarded her. Well, Saul forced her to leave him and marry an older man. We know nothing about that relationship from the book of Samuel, except the one verse, which is when David called for her to go back. Paltiel, that was the name of the older husband, followed them on foot while people were mocking him. And I just thought that was the most extraordinary picture of conjugal love. And so I was able to build up this picture, I hoped, of Michal having left the court, having left all the pressures of being the king's daughter and also married to David, and actually finding some peace in the countryside. And then there's so many contradictions in the book of Samuel. It's stated several times that Michal is childless. And to be childless in that world was to have no status at all as a woman. And yet at another point, we hear that David killed the 5 sons of Michal. Now, this can't be, both can't be true. And we're not having a discussion about biblical fundamentalism, but it's just one of the hundreds of instances which make that sort of thing such nonsense. But Merab, Michal's sister, had died. And so I then decided that the way to reconcile these contradictions and to give Michal a completely second dimension was to have her adopt these children. And then this goes, I mean, then after, obviously, after your former husband, now your husband again, kills your children, you have very complex feelings towards him. So that's how I built up Michal. Abigail, who was the second wife, we know was married to this very wealthy Calebite chief called Nabal. And he died of a sort of stroke, which immediately made me think he was overweight and unhealthy and all the sorts of things. And she has the longest speech by any woman in the entire Bible when she goes to David to try and persuade him not to attack her husband and his people. But that's all she has. I mean, basically, that's all you get of her. There are a lot of speculations about her. And so I tried to build up a story from that, and particularly about her relationship with her maid, Ahinoam, because Ahinoam, there's also ambiguity about that. Ahinoam is both the wife of Saul and the wife of David. So I don't want to say quite what I did about that, but there was that. And then, of course, the wife we all know best is Bathsheba. Partly, I'm afraid, was because she bathed, in the nude on her balcony or whatever. And therefore this gave painters and patrons throughout the Middle Ages and beyond the opportunity to have pictures of, yes, thank you. That's a rather discreet one, I think. And we rather carefully pushed my name slightly higher up the image so that the A in Arditti has never been quite so placed for a long time. Sorry. But so Bathsheba, there's a big question about her, whether she deliberately, bathed naked within the sights of the royal palace, I mean, or whether she was doing it quite innocently. And I have made a decision about that, largely based on ancient Jewish rituals whereby a woman had to cleanse herself after menstruation, and specifically you had to do it through running water. Therefore, that's why, in my opinion, she's doing it on the roof. And in my opinion, King David, who by that stage had become quite a sort of, almost a tyrant figure, I think he just took her. And then that gives, I think, a rather interesting slant to the whole of her story, which comes the sort of second part of the book, as to how she's surviving in this court. There are a lot of other women, let alone the men. And she is very, very anxious that her son will succeed. And we all know he becomes Solomon, but he isn't the natural heir. And so what Bathsheba does is very crucial to that. So I hope that from really little hints in the books of Samuel, I've been able to fill out the characters.
I'm really seeing how you've done that, actually, and how you have filled in those wonderful gaps. Now, this is a story that is very familiar in certain ways to people, versed in the Western spiritual tradition, Judaism or Christianity. So, for example, that phrase, Absalom, my son, I kind of knew what was going to happen, but I didn't know how it was going to come about. So there are these points that you absolutely have to get right, aren't there?
Well, I say at the very beginning, well, in a note at the beginning, that I've kept absolutely to this timeline, the events, the incidents in the Bible, with one or two exceptions, because actually some are completely self-contradictory. But I've filled in the characters, I hope enriched them. And I say that I've tried to make a 21st century fiction out of a 10th century BC myth. And so, yes, if you didn't have Absalom, my son, as it were, you know, some people would feel cheated. If you didn't have Bathsheba bathing, if you didn't have Goliath, if you didn't have David playing music, all these things, but you have to interpret them in a way that is consistent with the characters you have, I'd almost say created, certainly reinvented.
I think another issue also is our modern perspective. I mean, it's interesting that you say it has to be a 21st century novel. Our views of, just for example, mental illness, homosexuality, are inevitably very, very different. So I wanted to ask you specifically about David, who really has this very intense relationship with Jonathan, as you touched on earlier, and then has loads of wives. And you bring in Abigail at a wonderful point, which I won't spoil for readers. How did you think you have to sort of divest yourself of modern notions to a certain extent? Or is the point to use them and counterpoint them?
I think a little, I don't think there's any point in writing a historical, a biblical novel that is completely archaic. I mean, a novel I really don't like is Thomas Mann's Joseph and His Brothers, which, you know, in fact is about 2,000 pages. Sorry, I'm not quite such a sort of lightweight. He spends hundreds of pages on the ancient gods of, you know, the Middle East, and it becomes almost anthropological. What I wanted, I mean, in terms of the mental illness, Saul it is quite simply an evil spirit. That is how, and so you have to do that, but you have at the same time to make it clear what it is. I mean, the man is oppressed. He's oppressed by the prophet Samuel, who has anointed him, unless he later anoints David, and then sort of discarded him. It's quite arbitrarily, actually. And in terms of I mean, obviously, I don't think, they obviously don't see that David and Jonathan, we only ever see it from Michal's point of view as well. She comes across them. They are very, very close. And of course, there is the famous you know, elegy in the Bible where David talks of Jonathan, his love for Jonathan, or Jonathan's love for him, passing the love of women. Now, there have been endless debates about this. I mean, there is a novel called The Prince's Psalm by somebody called, I think I'm getting this right, Eric Shaw Quinn, an American novel. And he wrote a very good novel called Say Uncle before that. And I read this novel, and this is entirely about the relationship between David and Jonathan. And I'm afraid I don't like it very much. And that's partly because they are modern gay lovers. I mean, you know, they could be played, you know, by two Hollywood stars. Maybe they will be. But you have to keep very much, nobody perceives sexuality in the way that we do now. I mean, that's a truism, but they are just lying together as two comrades in arms, and that love becomes physical. And we only see we only see it very, very briefly through Michal at one point, but then there is evidence at the end of the novel, and I don't want to say that this has meant a lot to David. You know, he was obviously a very, very highly sexed man, and the great bulk. I mean, I'm sure that Jonathan was the only male lover he had, and I don't think we should get quite into gender fluidity or something at this point. But you know, they felt hugely for each other. I mean, at one point, and this is in both the Book of Samuel and the Anointed, Jonathan takes off his armor and gives it to David in front of in front of King Saul, which is a way of basically saying, "I am your servant. You will be my leader," which of course enrages his father. But you don't do that to somebody you just think is a better fighter than you, especially when you're the king's son and will command the army. There was clearly a deep, deep bond between them, but it wasn't. I'm sure it didn't go into anybody's sense of identity or anything like that. So in my case, the key thing is that Michal, who has found David not the lover she expected, if we can put it like that, gets what she thinks is a glimpse of why that's the case. And it's very, very disillusioning, you know.
I think we're coming to the end of the session now. Unfortunately, it has been absolutely fascinating. So just to repeat, Michael's novel is The Anointed. It's published by Arcadia. It came out during the lockdown, so we weren't able to raise a glass to Michael, but it is such an amazing story. It's a great escape into a kind of archetypal, primitive but fascinating and culturally rich world. So thank you for writing it, Michael, and thank you for joining us at LitFest Online.
Thank you for talking to me.